Welcome to a new episode of the International Comics Collective, only on UCPN. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the official first episode of the International Comics Collective. I am your host, Al Mega, joined by co-hosts all the way from the UK, ultra creator, pioneer. I mean, this is the man, my brother, right here, Mr. Dave Elliott. What's going on?
After that introduction, I was going like, oh, is there somebody else on the call I didn't know about? Thanks, man.
Absolutely, man. You rock. And all the way from Germany is one of my newest comic crusaders. Is one of the hottest Twitter feeds you've ever seen. That is Comics 101. I'm talking about none other than my man, Mr. Chris Buse. What's going on, bro?
Hi. How are you tonight, Al? How's it going?
All right. Listen to that voice, ladies and gentlemen. Way better than the special. Now it's a lot more silky than last time.
Yeah, getting there. Next time I'll be singing.
Oh man! Oh, you know what? I may hold you accountable to that. All right.
Yeah,
So,
folks,
that's it. We're gonna have to do a special recording.
Spoke too soon, huh?
You know what? We may make you the Celine Dion of Comic Crusaders. You know.
Ooh, yeah.
Chris is going to be the new Dos Equis man.
Oh man. It's fantastic. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this show is all about comics, especially from our perspectives, because again, we are comic collectors from different countries. You know, I'm based in the States, David in the UK, and Chris is all the way in Germany. And in this program, hopefully we're able to talk about our individual experiences in collecting in our individual countries, and how collecting is different, and how access is different, and how storylines, and obviously how appreciation maybe for certain books may exceed others. With that said, I want to give the floor to my man Buse here, because one of the things we want to discuss, obviously, who gave us our start in comics, and is there anything that we started with that we still collect today?
Okay. I got my start in comics when I was like 6 years old, born in 1967, so that was in the early 1970s. There was a neighborhood kid who was 6 years older than me, and he showed me these Marvel comics. And at that time, they were in German, because they were reprinting in the 1970s the Marvel comics right from the start. So I got the Fantastic Four by Kirby, and the first book I got from him, my very first comic was Fantastic Four 8. And I said, wow, this is cool stuff. And I really like this. And he showed me, they also published some DC stuff. And that was in the 60s. And that was that first showcase with Green Lantern by Jill Kane and John Broome.
Wow,
and
check that out.
The next thing I did, I took paper and pencil and I made my own Green Lantern stories. And I said, wow, this is the stuff for me. And first I started collecting these books in German. And I learned reading German by reading comic books in German. And then when I was a little bit older, 12, 13, 14, my English got better. We learned English in high school, my English got better. And I improved my English vastly by reading comics, because it was also possible to get books from the States, the originals. And I started to read these books. At first, no idea what they were really about. I thought somebody was a cool villain name, but I had no idea what that meant. But little by little, my English improved. And then I switched completely to reading the stuff in English. And let's say by the late 1970s, I was only reading the stuff in English. That was the time when the X-Men by Byrne came out and Daredevil by Miller. And that was really when I really got into collecting the originals, the original books. By that time, I had read all the complete Fantastic Four, 1 to 101 by Kirby. And that was still my favorite one, because that's the first book I've ever got, Fantastic Four number 8, still one of my favorite books. It's silly if you look at it now, and people give it to somebody who's 25, they'll say, oh, what is this? This is nonsense. Oh, Sue Long looks like Alice. What is this nonsense? But this was magic back then. It was magic. So that's how I got into comics.
And what about you, Dave, as a kid? What was your first experience? Who got you into it? And what was your first experience?
Well, I think like a lot of people, like in in the UK, back in the 60s and even before that, comics was so widespread. I mean, you compared to today, it's night and day. Like, comics were everywhere, newspapers, magazines. But almost every single corner store had comic books. We call like the newsagent had racks and racks of comics. They had the American comics, they had all the British comics, and because they were for every single genre and every single age group. So I think we were talking before we came on, Chris was talking about his mum, and you as well, Al. You were talking about like how your mum, your parents played a big part in that. And one of the things my mum used to say to me was, when I tried to think of the first comics, and she said, "Well, I started getting you your own comics when you used to, when I was a baby, I would literally chew on I had an older brother, and I would literally, I would tear at his comics and chew them and look at them when I was a baby." So there's all these, young comics, there's, people have heard of, some people have heard outside of the UK of comics like Beano and Dandy, because they're probably the most popular weekly ones, which are all usually very comedy based. It's like a 1-page or 2-page comedy story and funny with a punchline at the end. So it was Beano and Dandy as a kid, but there was other things. There was comics like Look and Learn, which was, the reason it was called Look and Learn, it was very educational. There was educational strips, there was educational features, text stories, but they had great British artists like Don Lawrence drawing this strip called Trigon Empire, which was pretty much a science fiction. Well, it was like a science fiction Roman Empire story. It was, imagine, Greece versus Rome, but as two planets, millions of miles apart from each other. And they looked very kind of Romanesque and Greek kind of in a way. And they were fantastic. But again, they were like 2-3 pages. And as a kid, something I also liked in things like this was in the center spread, they would have something like a submarine, a cross section of a submarine. So you could see a submarine and it would tell you which submarine it was. But it was also cut away, so you could see what it looked like inside, and it told you how it worked. And I used to find that fascinating as a kid. I loved stuff like that. I loved when Marvel, like Elliott Brown, who worked for Marvel, used to, in the Marvel Universe books, he would do all these cutaways of the Baxter Building and the Avengers Mansion, and you could see where people lived inside that, and where where the X-Men Danger Room was inside the mansion. You knew where it was because Elliott Brown had drawn it all out. And
those handbooks are so classic, Dave. Those are classic. I have a handful of them, in the comic form, and I also have the index. Remember the full-page index cards that came from Marvel Universe? They look fantastic in a binder. Oh my God! I wish they would do stuff like that nowadays, but we don't have those type of talents anymore, I think.
No, the talents are still there. Elliott Brown's still there.
Well, he needs to get it done.
He would do them, but he needs to be asked. Someone needs to go to him and commission them. I mean, I know he's asked them, said, "Hey, I'm still here. I'm still available. I can do these."
You know what? We're gonna bring him into the international comic collectives world instead, and let's create our own universe. Let's get it done.
Yeah. but those were the types of things that later on there were other comics, because I think for me, the most important comic I read as a kid was a comic called TV-21. And the TV came from the fact that most of the comic strips inside were actually from TV shows. But they were mostly the British puppet shows like Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, Stingray, Fireball XL5. And they were drawn, they were painted by the the most fantastic artists still to this day I've ever seen. Frank Bellamy, Ron Embleton, Jerry Embleton, Mike Noble. These guys, Brian Lewis, their artwork was just mind-blowing, and it was just fantastic, but it was all my favorite TV shows as well.
Sure.
And why I call this particular comic out is I'd read a ton of comics. I bought a ton of British comics. My mum would buy me British and American comics. My brothers would buy comics. This was the comic that flipped that switch in my head to say, I'm keeping this. And no, I'm not going to share this. If you want to borrow this, no, you can't. I'll tell you where I got it from, but I'm not sharing these. I'm not lending these out.
I get it.
So TV21 was that comic that switched me from just being a comic reader to a comic fan. This was the comic that I'm going to keep these. I'm going to put them all safe. I'm going to make sure nothing ever happens to them. And so that was that for me. So that's the big, I got into Kirby. Like Kirby's, today he's still like God to me. But this was the comics that if I hadn't got into this and I hadn't got into the collecting of comics with TV21, maybe I wouldn't have been carried on with comics.
Interesting. Check that out. So, in my experience, obviously, mine first was right off the shelf at an airport, The Saga of Crystal, the Crystal Warrior. And why did I select that as a kid? Because my mom, again, was trying to, make me quiet before we got on the plane to Puerto Rico. But what struck me was the cover art. Here's this warrior with a big sword, all crystal. You see this image of this woman, not fully materialized. All mysterious. And you see the coming of Ica and this evil warrior, wizard kind of behind her. So I was like, oh, what's going on? The cover to me just was so intriguing. And then looking back, as a kid, obviously, I'm not going to be looking at names. I'm looking at the artwork, and I got into the story. I started digging it. But, as I got older, who did the cover? Dave Simons. Editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. Who wrote the book? Mary Jo Duffy.
Right.
Who did the interiors? Brett Levin. So that was my first exposure, right? So then when we got back from PR, my mom again, started buying me Savage Sword of Conan. Now, again, I'm a little kid here. I should not be having access to this material at this stage. My first Savage Sword of Conan was number 134. I'll never forget it because it's Conan versus this giant gorilla on the cover. And I fell in love with that. I was like, yo, look at this diesel dude trying to fight off a gorilla. Can he do it? And then when I look back now as an adult, again, Jim Shooter once again. So I guess I'm part of that Jim Shooter generation of readers. When he was the EIC of Marvel, when I got into it. Who was the cover artist? Joe Jusko. Who wrote the book? Chuck Dixon. And I had the pleasure of interviewing. We've had the pleasure of interviewing him on Undercover Cape several times. So again, early influences, and again, don't you see a common theme here? Warriors, barbarians type stuff. Do you know that to this day, I'm still buying Conan? I'm buying books like Headlopper from Image.
Yeah.
Great book, but it's, set in this. So isn't it, for me, it's, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it stood with me. My early experiences that I still haven't given up on them. Because I've read other books after that, then I started getting onto the Byrne era of the X-Men when the Mutant Massacre was going on. I was reading Spider-Man during the Gang War. I was reading Captain America during Scourge storyline. So, there was a lot of fantastic stuff that I was able to have access to as a kid. But should I have been reading that stuff? If you look at it by today's standards, they would have been flipping their lid over Scourge, for example. A regular guy killing superheroes. Or villains rather, and again, those early Savage Sword of Conan, those were crazy books. I mean, right now they, doing new Savage Sword of Conans. They are no level of what was printed before. I'll say that.
Right.
But again, look how that stuck with me. So while I've still delved out into other genres, if you will, I still have this soft spot for what when it comes to the warriors, the barbarians types, and and the sorcery, if you will, type books. I don't know. It just stuck with me. I don't know if you guys have felt the same.
Yeah.
Sure, of course.
What stuck with you the most? Has there been anything that to this day that you started off as a kid that you're still buying? There anything, Dave, Chris, that you buy to this day? You say this was from early on.
I think what I always go back to is Kirby, and I haven't read all by Kirby because there's so much. But Kirby was the first artist I really fell in love with, and after Kirby, it's Buscema, John Buscema. I really like this one of the Avengers, inked by George Klein. That was also my gem. And I always go back to these stories because there's always a chance to read them, to experience them in a new format. I have these stories in various formats, digital and print. Always go back to these. And these are still my gold standard. Are they old-fashioned? Sure, they are old-fashioned. But they are still magic. And I love this stuff. And everything new that comes out, it has to measure up against those old ones.
Yeah. If we want to get into old, I want to talk about something magical that a lot of people, I guess, clamor for, but I guess it's left up to interpretation. Are they working this particular group of superheroes right? Now, I think all of us, at one point or another, have held in our hands a Legion of Superheroes book.
Yeah.
I mean, who hasn't? Now, from what era? You tell me. I mean, we've had several eras. I'll start this time with Dave. Legion of Superheroes, I think something that's very underrated. I think sometimes improperly used. Sometimes gets over confusing, especially when DC had all these alternate lines and they wound up doing almost a Crisis of Legion of Superheroes where we had all these alternate universe legions. How do you feel about Legion? Have you been a fan, and if so, what is your favorite continuity of the Legion?
See,
tough question.
Because I've been, what it is. I mean, Legion is one of those. It's been around a long time, and I can remember buying some of the very first appearances. The Kurt Swan drawn stories, really early on in Adventure Comics and the Superboys, and they were fun. I mean, it was they when I first started reading them, they were just fun. I just saw them as cool characters that popped up in Superboy.
Yeah.
I read some of the early solo stories, and they were fun. And because at that point DC wasn't swamping the market with too much material, I bought most of the comics and anything I could get my hands on, and read them, enjoyed them, and just I think there was a period when they started doing things like Legion 89, and there was the Legionnaires as well as the Legion, as well as it was like suddenly 3 or 4 books just about the Legion,
and there wasn't the acronym Legion, if you will, as well, the acronym that they brought down.
And I just felt that there didn't need to be 4 books about the Legion. There just needs to be one good one.
Mm-hmm.
And because there was 4, instead of me continue to buy Legion, I dropped all of them because it was just, they were bleeding into each other. And because I didn't like some of it, I just stopped buying it. Which was a shame because some of it was still really good. And I think overall, like when Keith Giffen was doing his thing on it, I think that was overall my favorite period for story-wise. But if you ask me who my favorite artist was on Legion, it would have to be Dave Cockrum.
Yeah, he's the beast.
Yeah.
I think no one would ever argue with you on that.
Chris, but see, this is where I bow to Chris. Like Chris's knowledge on the Legion is way superior to mine, and I think that I think that's a thing. It's like when you lose a thread, when you drop off from a title, it's after several years, it's very easy to sort of forget the gems that you really loved in the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been a lifelong Legion fan, and I also dropped off at the point where Dave dropped off when Giffen was doing his thing. When the Baxter series started, that was kind of cool, and then I kind of dropped off. The first Legion book I've read was Superboy 195 from 73. That's the story where Wildfire gets introduced, and he gets killed off, sort of, in the first issue. And this is by Cockrum, and the art, even when I was 7 or 8 years old, it was amazing. It was extremely slick. The costumes looked very modern. He had redesigned the costumes. I had no idea. That was the first Legion story I've ever read. And everything looked very modern, very futuristic, and at the same time it looked very 70s. And fashion in Germany was a little bit like that. It was not to that extreme, but everything was disco. It was getting there. It was the pre-disco days. Everything was getting shorter and tighter. And even as a young boy, I was really like, wow, this is much more to the point, much more modern, and much more like what my world looks like here in Germany. And I said, wow, this is cool. This is not as stilted, quote unquote, as some other comics I was reading at that time. And I really liked that. And I continued reading Legion, but then Grell came on, Mike Grell, and he took it to another level. And then Sherman. I love this stuff. These are some of my favorite books still to this day. And there was a reason why I ran a long series of tweets on Twitter about the Legion, because I wanted to get some people into the Legion. And obviously a few guys said, wow, cool. I had no idea the Legion was this cool. I will check out these books. And yeah, why not? These are like the X-Men, only before the X-Men.
All right, so Chris, let me ask you, since you're the whiz here on this. Jim Shooter, at 14 years old, right, at the time, he wrote his first Legion story, right? And then he became a regular writer, and then he wrote a short story in which Pharaoh Lad died. So this was the first death of a Legionnaire. Was that impactful to you? Did you read that particular issue, and did you think that Jim Shooter at the time, started pushing Legion into more seriousness because of that impactful death?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question you're posing here, because as we got these books in Germany, we didn't get all the books, and I never got this issue. I've read it in the meantime, but I never read it as a kid. But what I did read was basically they had these spreads in Germany they had like trades where they collected several issues all mixed together, some from the 70s, some earlier ones, and they had these spreads. And in these spreads, they were explaining, Farrellet, he had died. I said, whoa, what is this? And there's Lightning Lad, and he lost an arm. I said, how is that even possible in a comic book? How can they lose a limb? That's not possible. And I erased that out because as a kid, that was too shocking for me. I didn't want to deal with that. I didn't want to deal with it. Now I've read this story, and I say, okay, it's a very cool story, and I can look at it from hindsight and can say, okay, Shooter did a very good job here. And it's an interesting story, and it holds up. I read it a few years ago, and it's powerful. It's a powerful story.
All right. So then I have another one for you. One of the most popular, I think, Legion stories, at least of recent memory that's, lies in the mythos of a lot of DC fans, is the Great Darkness Saga during the Paul Levitz era. All right. Which, for a lot of you that don't know, let's just say that Darkseid does a full assault on the United Planets. All right.
Oh, you spoiled it now.
I mean, he crazy. But you got to see the concept of what Darkseid is doing. Is he's really twisted, and apparently because of this one particular storyline, a lot of people felt that this made Legion something of much more of a real science fiction saga that was really, deep Would you agree with that assessment because of that particular story? Either of you could answer this one.
Well, I jumped right in because I have just reread that story because I didn't like it the first time I read it. I read it the first time like 10 years ago, and I didn't really like it because I didn't like the art that much, and I couldn't really fully appreciate it. Now that I've read more of The Forced World and all the stuff that surrounds it, I like it much more. And I would go so far to say this is one of the first. If this came out today, it would be a summer event. This would be like Civil War, the comic. It would be a huge, huge thing. And back then, I think they kind of invented that format because before it became really popular. This is an event comic. Before they even knew what an event comic was. And then if you read it today with that mindset, you see how forward-thinking they were, Levitz and Giffen.
Yeah,
and
because
it's a very good book.
You know, you're right.
Very, very good.
I'm sorry, just so before you go, David, I just want to let people know this particular storyline ran in the Legion of Superhero story, right? And to go to Chris's comment about being an event book, it's an in-house, entitled event that went from issue 287, then 290 to 294, and then annual 3. So there you have, you know, quite a numerous amount of issues, 6 issues dedicated to this, or 7 issues dedicated to this one particular storyline. So an in-house event preceding events.
Well, that's all I was actually. That's kind of what I was going to bring up because when Chris was talking about the big crossover, kind of the big summer event type of thing, it was. But as you rightly pointed out, it was an entitled event. It was. Mm-hmm. It wasn't 10 titles that all crossed over. It was just it. You know.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things. Well, yeah, but you see, the thing was, it was kind of an extension almost as well as what you know, Claremont and Byrne were doing on the X-Men, which is you could have short stories. You'd have a little short stories. You'd have maybe a 2-part, 3-part, and then there'd be something building. Chris would be building something in the background, and then it would start to come to the fore. And you'd had all these sort of shorter stories, and then all of a sudden it's like, bang, you're into a 6-part story, and it's epic.
Yes.
And then right afterwards, you're back down in the, let's spend an issue with everyone at the mansion. How are they dealing with the repercussions of that massive 6-month battle? And you kind of, everyone sorts their head out for an issue, and then you get back, and then it sort of, the next big story starts to build up again.
And that's what they did so different too at that time. They gave you that issue, like, these characters, let them, you know, have an issue to deal with the repercussions of said events. And, you know, as a fan, that's when you really connect with those characters. Because it's fun to watch them in battle, of course, no doubt. But I think it's those issues, you know, the after effects where you connect the most.
Well, this particular storyline for me was the one where I'd waned a little bit on Legion. I wasn't sort of, you know, necessarily feeling it really. And the fact that they used Darkseid was kind of like, oh. Now, being a huge Kirby fan, and I've always been very wary of when DC play with Kirby's characters, because no matter who it is, no matter how great they are, they just kind of, they don't. I mean, again, this is like when you become. Probably because I'm too big a fan of Kirby, but the voices that these other creators bring to his characters, I don't feel it. I just I don't get this. I prefer if you didn't do this. I prefer if you actually created something new. If you don't know how to handle Kirby's characters, box them off and leave them alone.
Yeah.
And so when they used Darkseid, I was a bit wary, but they had a really neat angle on it, because obviously, clearly it was, you know, it's the 30th century. It's like, wow, Darkseid's still around.
Yeah. And
it was how he was around and how they treated him and what he was doing. Because I don't want to give it away, because it really is a good story that you should go and pick up. I think it's still in a trade somewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
You know? Yeah, absolutely.
I think if anything, if DC is to produce a Legion animated film, I think this is the perfect movie to do.
Yeah.
I think
of this
there's
story.
enough material in there that it's like if you're going to do an animated DC movie of the Legion, do this story, but do it over 2 films.
Yes, that's what I was thinking too. Yeah, 2 films.
It's too big, and it's such a good story. And the thing is, because the audience isn't ready for Legion, you'd have to do too much groundwork on telling people who the Legion were. So I think it's something you aspire to, you work to. You want to go, okay, well, let's do a couple of Legion movies that sets the groundwork for that story.
Yeah, definitely.
But it was really one. And outside, the only other time I've actually liked what DC have done with the Dark Side and some of the Kirby material was actually Chris Claremont and Walt Simonson when they did the X-Men Teen Titans crossover.
Okay.
That was a fantastic, intercompany crossover. But I just loved that. And Walt Simonson's rendition of Dark Side in that book was absolutely amazing. Spot on.
Yeah, see, my favorite Dark Side, and this is now stepping away from Legion, but it was that story during the New 52 when he finally got the anti-life equation, Final Crisis, because then that finally explained Kirby's AD world of Kamandi. Did you not?
Yeah.
Did you not read the Final Crisis?
No,
I didn't. I didn't.
Man, listen. I enjoy Commandy and all that good stuff from that era. Atomic Knights, etc. That whole Final Crisis storyline basically explained, that specific DC world of the Commandy world. How it got destroyed. So if you're a fan of Commandy, you must read Final Crisis, which now explains to you how that specific world came to be.
Fascinating.
But see, personally, again, this is me being Kirby fan. I loved the Kirby Commandy stories. I thought they were great. It was like here's Jack taking something that, it's Planet of the Apes. Okay, we know.
Reverse, kind of reverse, a little bit reverse more. You give it more freedom to the human character there.
Oh yeah, but
you have no monkeys. Yeah, a mix of stuff actually.
Oh yeah, no, he it's basically it's as though someone said, "Hey, do Planet of the Apes," and he goes, "Oh, I'm not going to just do Planet of the Apes. I'm just going to blow this up big time."
Oh yeah,
and it was amazing and it was fantastic. And I usually find that when someone tries to explain it's like, well, no, Kirby kind of explained it already. Kirby's done his version. Do I need another creator to tell me what Kirby was actually thinking when he wasn't thinking that?
Yeah, Dave, do you think Kirby smoked weed or something to come up with so much stuff? He was a very creative person.
He was, and Kirby. Remember, if you go back and you look at comics in general, remember, Kirby was someone who, throughout his life, he didn't just draw superheroes. It was the Kirby with Joe Simon who literally created the romance comic industry. Kirby did war comics. He did the romance comics. He did superheroes. He did science fiction. He did humor, and and it's true crime stories. So he had all of that. And remember, you're reading real stories. You're trying to absorb all of this material, which actually, when you read all that material and then you end up doing a superhero story using some of that, it makes it feel that much better because you've done the research. You've read up about it. You've got it's like having an arsenal. It's like if you're as a creator, if you've got weapons, it's like bang, he's done everything, so he can pull from everything to create a better story.
I always love the story his daughter tells, that when he was 6 years old, he would paint the walls in the tenement where the family was living at that time. And that's amazing. I mean, he was 6 years old and using the walls in the house to express himself. And you could tell he was a genius, basically, from that.
Do you guys believe that Kirby's underrated at any one point? There's so many Kirby haters out there, and I guess me so mad when I believe that this man was just. I think it was just beyond his time.
He's not underrated. He's undercredited
and underappreciated.
Great word there. Great word.
Well, I think it's the undercredited because you see, you have to look back and understand that there was an entire period of Marvel's history where, because Kirby was trying to, and his family were trying to sue to get credit and money from that they were owed from Marvel, his name was exorcised from everything. And that's why, and the fact that, Stan Lee, who, I've met, I've worked with Stan Lee, so I've known him, I liked him. But one of the things that he would be very quick to do is he'd be happy to take credit for something. If he was part of it, it kind of became him.
So if you were just in the room, for example, and you're Stanley, and I'm Omega, and I just happened to say that day in that room, yo, Stan, you like this name, Comic Crusaders, if I do this website? So all of a sudden, if he said yes, would he consider himself a co-creator?
No. But you see, here's how Stan worked, and some of it is legitimate to a certain degree. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning of the Marvel universe. And a lot of this, you have to also bring in Martin Goodman, who was Stanley's uncle, who was the owner of Marvel at the time. So once they decided, the comics were dying out and they were making a last-ditch effort to save Timely Comics, effectively. And Martin Goodman was all ready to give up comics. So, Stan reached out. He pulled in Jack Kirby, pulled in Steve Ditko, Larry Leiber, Dick Ayers, the guys who've been working for Timely a lot. And they look, we're going to try to do something new. We're trying to sort of let's focus on superheroes because DC's doing reasonably well and they've got some cool characters. But it's like someone like Martin Goodman would go, okay, well, Justice League of America is a good selling comic. We need the Justice League of America. Challenges of the Unknown is a good comic. You need to have a Challenges of the Unknown. And, hey, well, Jack was one of the creators of Challenges of the Unknown, so let's do Challenges of the Unknown, but give them superpowers, real superpowers. And voila, you've got the Fantastic Four. Once you've started to create Thor, Hulk, Iron Man, Martin Goodman says, give me a Justice League. Stan goes to Jack, we need a Justice League. Jack goes, oh, let's just team these guys together. Let's bring in Iron Man, Hulk, Ant-Man, and these other characters. Let's have them meet. And because he's the guy who says, give me something like Challenge the Unknown. And between the two of them, you end up with Fantastic Four. So by asking him for something like something else, that wouldn't have existed. What Jack comes up with wouldn't have existed if Stan hadn't asked him. So therefore, he considers himself a co-creator.
Gotcha.
I know. Makes sense.
Yeah,
makes sense. Makes total sense.
Well, it makes sense. Do you agree?
I agree.
Okay.
Totally agree.
But then there's a larger conversation as well. So let's take a look at Spider-Man, for instance. As from what I've read, pretty much Spider-Man started because Joe Simon and Jack Kirby pitched a character called Spider-Man. to Stan Lee.
Okay.
Stan liked the name, but he didn't like the character they'd come up with. He kind of looked like he was a guy with a gun. He, was a very, he was an adult, looked a bit Captain American-ish, but without the shield, and had a gun instead, and it fired webs. And so, but it was it's a group effort.
Yeah.
And so even if you say, okay, well, let's include Joe Simon and Jack Kirby for a second. Okay. By the time Amazing Fantasy 16 comes out, you've got this story by Steve Ditko that Steve's clearly had worked on the story as well as the art. Stan Lee, it wouldn't have happened without Jack Kirby, Joe Simon pitching the idea. So that first issue, you could say, was created by those four people. Now let's move forward to, if you're Marvel Studios, Disney, and you're working on a new Spider-Man movie and you want to bring in some characters, you now have over 50 years worth of characters created by not just those four people now. You've got Ross Andru, John Romita, Gil Kane, you've got writers like Jerry Conway, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Mark Millar. It's like, everybody, Dan Slott, all these guys have contributed to Spider-Man now. You look at the Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse, would that movie have happened without Dan Slott,
Bendis,
and everybody else that, like the creators that came up with, who did the Spider-Gwen comic?
Yeah.
Because you look at that, even down to Rico Renzi, who was the colorist. They kept some of his color schemes and styles in the movie. They took some of that. So, as it grows, you see, like in the movies now, in the thanks section, they'll have like 20 artists and 20 creators, because that's what they're pulling on. Those people, because the Spider-Man universe, the Marvel universe, the Hulk universe, it grows every month because somebody new has created something new for that universe that could potentially get used later elsewhere.
Okay, but that's the word. You say created, but to me, it's contributed to the universe, because I saw, I spoke of an example once where I saw a particular comic creator say that they are a creator of Iron Man, but this creator, for me, didn't create. Yes, added to the mythos, but to say the words creator of Iron Man, I think that's too deep. Too deep.
No, you can't say that. But what you can say is, I am one of the creators that have contributed to or created the Iron Man universe, the Iron Man mythos, as you say.
Because this particular artist, yes, he created certain characters, if you will, or certain looks and whatnot. I give them full credit for that. I just don't like that wording. Creator of Iron Man. No, you're not. You contributed to, but you're not a creator. These are certain things. I get touchy with that after watching that documentary about Bill Finger. That is a heartbreaking ladies and gentlemen, if you have not watched this documentary about Bill Finger and just about the lack of his name not being put out there, and just the horrible actions by what should have been his friend and co-creator, instead somebody that just took credit. Just watch this. I mean, this hopefully teaches people to be careful when they create things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we should do, as we won't do it now, but I think as a future podcast, we should actually we'll do it as a talk about all the different scenarios where something is created and how it's created and how to protect yourself.
And Dave, I could even bring
Yes.
Athena Finger on. We met her at Rhode Island Comic Con. We actually added her at a table and talked. And it was because of Athena that her grandfather got the credit that he deserved for his co-creation in the Batman mythologies. So if you even want to have her come on and talk, from that perspective, I should be more than happy to come
Oh
on with her.
yes, absolutely. That would be awesome.
But don't forget also, you also have to remember that, yes, Bill Finger, but there's others like Jerry Robinson, who never gets enough credit for his contributions. Like, more Bill Finger, definitely, but anyone that, Bob Kane was putting his name on other people's work for 30 years.
And I don't know, Dave, just from your creator angle, how do you see that this person was just out there basically robbing creators?
I think it's despicable. Absolutely, I think it is the worst of the worst. I think that it's that thing of, here's someone who, because he had the relative who was a lawyer draw up a contract for his favor, and I mean, who's to say? Like, I'm sure for a number of years, Bill Finger was probably very happy for regular work.
Oh, I'm sure. You got a straight paycheck is one thing, but just to see that this guy, he, again, even after the documentary, I started delving into a little bit more. I mean, Mr. Kane was a very arrogant man. Holy crap!
And he wasn't even smart, because he signed a contract initially that wasn't to his benefit, and he told his parents about it, and they told him, "You are mad," and they went back to DC and said, "Well, Bob is not E.T. This contract is void."
Yeah,
since DC wanted this character, they said, "Okay," he set up a new contract. And it was not even Bob Kane himself who got this contract. It was his parents for him. And, let's say he was probably older than 17 at that time. But his birth certificate somehow got lost. And so they got him a better deal. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Chris, let me ask you, are you a Batman fan?
Oh, sure.
All right. So how do you feel about that? There was this one person trying to take the credit all this time. And then later on in life, find out, there was this other man that, took a huge part in it. How do you feel that as a fan perspective?
Well, there's this wonderful cartoon that says it all, because you probably have seen it. It's like a drawing what would be Batman without the finger. And it's that Batman in this pink or purple outfit Bob Kane originally envisioned with the purple gloves, and basically doing nothing because he has no idea what to do with the character, and it finishes after one page. And then this is kind of like that, because the original, if you look at, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that was written and drawn by Ty Templeton.
Yeah, I remember. It was amazing. You look it up on the internet. It's very funny, and it's very true, I think. If you look at the original sketches, what has survived of Bob Kane's original idea, it looks nothing like what Batman really became. And Bill Finger, from what I understand, was a few years older, and he was into pulps, and he was writing for pulps. And he took some ideas from The Shadow and other sources, and Zorro, of course, and molded it into this new character, which was very pulp influenced. If you go back and look at the first stories, it's a very, very dark comic. Batman kills, and it's a grim comic. It's a complete opposite of Superman. And it's quite interesting, and it's a very, very interesting character. And it's basically, Batman is basically the status quo. And it's quite interesting to have these two characters, whereas Superman initially is a socialist, and you have Batman, who is more or less the establishment. It's quite interesting that they started out with these two characters.
Yeah, and I think that it also goes, I think one of the things people forget too much is, if you look back on history, and if you look back, a lot of people forget where characters come from. So, as you rightly said, Batman, he's Zorro, he's the Shadow, he's a mixture of the two, but brought a little bit up to date by a few years, and he's constantly evolved where the characters like the Shadow and Zorro didn't. If you go back and I think it was I remember seeing in one of Jim Steranko's encyclopedias on comics, he had one of the very first drawings that was submitted for Superman, and the very first drawing of Superman that was done was not in the costume we know today, but in a pose and action very much like Doc Savage.
Oh,
when
really?
You think of, so when you think of like Superman, and if you go back to where the origins of the story, he's a mixture of, there's two pulps at the time. Everyone is very familiar with Doc Savage, but there's another book that you should read called The Gladiator by Philip Wiley.
Oh yeah, I knew it was going there.
Yeah, and it's
basically Superman.
It's exactly Superman, except for the fact he's not alien. It's the scientist father who experiments on his own unborn son, so that when he's born with superpowers. He's super strong, skin's very strong, run very fast, lift tanks.
So what is it, a novel or a comic?
It's a novel,
but they made a comic out of it.
And when is the novel from?
I think it's 1931.
Wow.
Yeah, 31, 32, something like that.
Yeah, so
it predates Superman.
And he looks basically like Doc Savage. His look, his appearance is basically like Doc Savage.
Yeah. So here you have a character who's, it's that mixture. Because if you look at Superman in the past, like the way people have depicted Superman is he's super intelligent. He's like this scientist with superpowers. Well, that was Doc Savage.
Yeah.
And now what they've done is they put a cape on him, and he's got X-ray vision and heat vision. And he flies. But he, Superman sprang from Doc Savage and Gladiator.
All right, guys, listen. You mentioned Doc Savage, and even I remember him. I remember him at least having a '70s line of comics within Marvel, but obviously, he predates that. Why doesn't Doc Savage really stick with fans or resonate? I mean, because I think he's a very cool character, but he just doesn't resonate with fans now.
It's for the reason they've mentioned towards Batman, because the character has not evolved. It's still the same character as he was depicted in the 30s pulps. There is nothing new, nothing fresh about the character. And
growth.
Exactly. He hasn't adapted to the times. So when you think of Dr. Savage, you see him in those khaki pants and the white shirt and his gang of friends and helpers. It all looks the same. It's great. It's fantastic. I read those pulps when they reprinted them in German in the 70s. Fantastic books, but they are dated extremely, and it's very interesting. I give you another example. The Phantom is a very cool character.
Yeah.
And only recently I learned that in Scandinavia, for some reason, the comic book publishers didn't have the rights to Batman. So they couldn't publish any Batman comics, but they had the rights to the Phantom. Okay. And they said, well, but we don't want to just reprint the old stories. Can we do new stories with the Phantom? And in Scandinavia, they made new Phantom stories. If you go to Denmark, the Phantom is huge in Denmark. And he has these modern adventures. And he's modern day. He's not that character from the jungle. He's in modern day times. And I heard some guys say, well, when they made the movie in the early 90s with the Speeding Dane, they were really surprised that they would set that movie in the 1930s, because that's not the Phantom they know, because the Phantom is in current time. So they developed their own Phantom mythos in Scandinavia. It's amazing. And this never happened to Doc Savage, to my knowledge. There were more modern stories in the comics, but they never really caught on.
But I think that see now, here's I think where we might actually disagree. What my thoughts are on things like Doc Savage, Shadow, Phantom. They are of a time period. To one of the things that we've seen over and over again, and I think this is where it's not even about the West. it's very much about pretty much America versus the rest of the world as far as their publishing. Instead of just leaving something like, okay, well, that was of its time. Okay, yeah, I mean, let's move on. Let's create something new. Because that was of its time. I mean, yes, they've constantly revamped Batman, because that was an easier one to do than Superman is, but it keeps changing. And because it keeps changing, they're going to keep changing it, which brings me to 2 points, which is, one is, I personally would prefer if they kind of started boxing away some of these characters and would just like, look, we've had too much of this character. Like, can't we just like end it now? So let's stop. Let's create something new. Yeah, but the other thing is, fans often, they get really upset when a character changes, and I'm going like,
yes,
what do you expect? It always changes every time.
Yeah, but if you make it interesting, I mean, if you take the other pop character we mentioned, the Shadow, in the 1980s, Howard Chaykin revamped the Shadow. He brought him into modern times, and then we had the run by Andy Halfer and Kyle Baker, and before that we had the Sienkiewicz run. Amazing stuff, and they didn't break the character. They made him interesting. They made him modern, and they made him for the times, and that's quite interesting. I think it's possible if you have the right talent behind it.
I agree with Chris there, because you could modernize any character, and it's all in the writing. I mean, you gotta just modernize the character, make them interesting.
Or why don't you do Simon & Schuster or Siegel & Schuster, Siegel & Schuster, or Bob Kane did with Bill Finger, or Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did, which is, okay, let's take this thing. This is cool. There's some cool aspects to the Shadow. Let's take some of that. Let's take some of this. Let's mix it up and create something new that doesn't need that baggage. You're not bringing baggage with you.
Yeah.
And you can do both. You can do both.
But why? Because you see, me personally, and this is just a personal feeling. So I think that when a creator comes up with a character, that creator should be the person who decides when enough's enough.
Yes, agreed.
It's keep it personal, and don't do too much of anything.
You see, I agree.
But by that token, the Amazing Spider-Man would have ended with number 38 when Ditko left.
Right.
No, but you see, those characters, you could grow them, because you got to extend them to have family and see if a legacy exists. Why not? This is why, like Brian K. Vaughan. I'm sorry, Dave. For example, Brian K. Vaughan, why The Last Man? He had a story set. There was a beginning. There was an end. The Boys, the beginning with Boys is Ernest, right? Got that, Ernest?
Yeah.
I mean, sure. It had a beginning and an end. 100 Bullets had a beginning and an end. I mean, sometimes it's necessary. Some stories can't just go on, because let's go, for example, and I'm going to be honest here, Walking Dead is getting very stale.
Yeah, but we are not talking about the same thing here. The Shadow had no end. It just finished. It just fell out of favor, and then it was revamped. That's a different thing.
But why did it come out of favor? What are the creators doing wrong that the character doesn't stay in the favor of current fans?
Because he didn't fit the landscape anymore. He didn't adapt.
But I think
missing?
But I think every time someone's gone, hey, let's revamp it, no matter how good you think the Andy Helfer, Bill Sienkiewicz run was, and anything that's followed in Howard Chaykin, none of those sold better than the original pulps did.
Gotcha. None.
Of course not.
So, but it's this thing of diminishing returns. It's like, why are we still trying to, how many times have people had a go at Flash Gordon? I love seeing Al
Ah,
Williams. Like when Al Williams did a couple of issues at Marvel.
Oh,
yes.
amazing,
I
amazing
know what you're
stuff.
Yeah,
talking about. Yes.
yeah, he did these
Amazing.
2 issues. I think Mark Schultz had written it. Great 2 issues, beautiful stuff, and
Beautiful.
it's
Absolutely.
nostalgic. It's great,
Fantastic, fantastic.
but that's kind of it. I don't know why we need to have a monthly Shadow comic or a monthly Doc Savage comic. Why don't do it's not needed. Like if you really want to do something, why don't you just go, okay, well, like let's just adapt all the we'll reimagining the books. We'll go back to the books and we'll do adaptations of the books, but freshen them a little bit.
So, but this goes back to you, both of you guys. Then, do you think those type of characters still something that's relevant to readers nowadays? A Doc Savage, a Phantom, these characters that are basically adventure-based characters. I mean, do you think that there's an interest in adventure-based characters in comics nowadays on that scale?
Yes. Yeah,
On
Absolutely,
that,
absolutely, absolutely,
you think?
absolutely.
Do you miss that
Yes.
personally?
Yeah, but what I want to see is I don't want to see someone keep trying to reimagine something else because it dilutes it. Every time someone does a new version of Doc Savage or the Shadow or anything else, it dilutes everything that's gone before.
All right, Dave,
And
let me put this in layman's terms for everybody listening. Stop rebooting the goddamn stuff and just keep telling good stories. Stop rebooting.
no,
Right?
stop just pillaging the past and create new material.
Yeah,
And
just move forward with the characters. Done.
and the problem is they've done so little new creation. Like literally, if you look at the Marvel universe,
Please don't even get me started on that. I mean, every 6 months there's a new first issue.
well, I'm not going to touch on that. I'm not going to touch on that aspect. What I'm going to touch on more is like you consider look in the first 10 years of Marvel up until the point where Jack Kirby left, and when Steve Ditko left 5 years before him.
Okay.
Look at all the characters that just those two guys created.
Oh, a plethora.
Now, so that's the first 10 years. How many characters on that level? Now, we've got, thousands of characters have been created, but
none on that level. I get you.
But on that level, how many have been created since they left? It's like
I agree with Dave, but then again, I don't agree, because if you look at something like what Alan Moore did with Miracle Man, that was an existing character, and he completely revamped the character. And he did the same with Swamp Thing. If you say, okay, let's have the character the way he always was, the way that we created him in Bernie Wrightson, we would not have had the Swamp Thing run by Alan Moore.
You know what?
If you have a cool story, change
right.
it.
No,
Exactly.
Swamp Thing is a different beast, man.
What happened after that, though? How long did the Alan Moore? See, I'm not saying that things shouldn't actually happen, but what I'm saying that maybe we could also just pull it back a little bit. Like yes, Alan Moore created a fantastic run of Swamp Thing.
He did,
and then it just carried on, and other people took it on, and it got cancelled, and then it came back, and it went on, and then it got cancelled, and then it went. Some Ron rebooted it, and then it got cancelled, and then someone else rebooted it, and it got cancelled. It's like it's this thing of, I was talking to Paul Levitz once, and we were talking about the books, and I was going like, well, you've got a monthly Swamp Thing comic. There was a Hawkman monthly comic, and I think it was Black Hawk.
Yeah,
and they were monthly. Black
Hawk.
I mean, come on,
Yeah.
And I said, you've got 3 titles there. That's money that's being spent. You've got 12 issues of each of those being spent each year. Why don't you, to save you money, but actually probably make you the same amount of money in the long run, is just do a 4-issue miniseries a year of Black Hawk, 4 issues of Swamp Thing, 4 issues of Hawkman or Hawk World, whatever it was at the time, but put a creative team on it that loves it, that's going to spend 8 months doing 4 issues, or they're going to spend all year doing 4 issues, and it's going to be so beautiful that people are going to want to, like, oh man, I can't wait till next year for the next one, rather than putting out 12 issues of kind of meh comics, when you could put out 4 and make them really good, and then you collect them and you make a trade, and those trades keep selling because, wow, that someone's put their heart and soul into those 4 issues. And instead of that, you've got 12 issues of kind of like, someone's kind of, they've done their work, they've done their duty. I think that if you treat, Shadow like that, if you do Doc Savage like that, you do Zorro like that, but just keep it to only do it if you've got a really good story, and not just crank it out for the sake of, we got to get this comic out, we got to get 12 issues of this out a year.
I agree. I think it's always when you have a good story and a good talent behind it, and if what you said, I mean, if the stories are good, if you think about the original Longbow Hunters by Grell, that thing is still in print. It's a beautiful series. It's fantastic. I don't know how long Grell worked on it, and everything else he did and other creators did on Green Arrow pales in comparison. And it's a fantastic story. Why not?
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. All right. So, we're closing in here on our hour mark, if you will. What are the things we want to touch upon right now then, in regards to our accessibility? Because, I want to go back to Legion a little bit then. What was your first issue that you saw on the stands? And I'll defer this one to Chris.
On Legion?
Yeah.
Legion,
what was the first
Legion?
issue you picked up ever in your life?
Oh, my first comic book, or the first
your
Legion
first
book?
Legion, your first Legion book.
Oh, yeah, it was Superboy 195.
Oh, wow, he knows from his heart, boy. I love that.
That's the story where Wildfire dies. I mentioned it before. Fantastic story. I love it to this day.
And Dave, what was your first Legion book?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I can remember, those stories where you'd see like there'd be someone like Superboy had been rejected from the Legion of Superhero on the cover, and like, wow, who would reject Superboy? Something like, I think that was one of my first, but I can't remember when. It was like so long ago. It was like, again, it was interesting because, going back for a little bit about like those introductions to them, is we didn't always have fantastic distribution in the UK, and because as a kid, sometimes if I didn't have money, it would depend on, is my mum going to bring me home some comics? And she's brought me a comic.
So that means the little David sweep the house today. Did he clean? Did he do all his homework? No. It's funny. Like I was one of those, like, my school was close enough that I used to come home from school for lunch and then go back to school in the afternoon. And my mum had she had a part-time job in the morning, so she would get home just before I did, and just to start making my lunch. And sometimes she would come, if she had time, she'd stop off at the newsagents and buy me a couple of comics. But it was Superman or Action or World's Finest, and she wasn't looking at the numbers. She wasn't going, oh, he's got that one already. Yeah. Yeah.
So it would kind of be random. It'd be like, oh, this looks like it was her call. She would go, oh, this looks kind of good. Oh, I think you like this one.
That was my mom too. She would just pick some random Conan, some random G.I. Joe, some random Marvel team up. And then when I would stay with my aunt, which is, my mom's sister, because she lived in Bushwick, New York, and she was 6 blocks away from this bookstore that sold 50-cent packets of comics, Dave and Chris. Yeah. 50 cents, but you would get 4 comic books for 50 cents. All right, so I would go there, and then obviously that's where I got my start with the X-Men and Chamber of Chills, and horror comics and whatnot. Crypt. Well, it was Crypt of Chambers, whatever the hell it was called. So I got my start really, again, where my mom threw Chris Star, Conan, but then my aunt taking me to that store, Marvel Team Up, X-Men, Hulk, Legion, a lot of stuff. Did you guys have a shop in your areas growing up where you could pick up a packet of books like that for very little amount of money?
Not me, no.
I did.
You did, all right.
Because they were selling these the Marvel books, the German Marvel books. They were selling them as used comics for half or 1/3 of the cover price, and we as kids would buy all these old issues, and we completed our rights. You would buy, let's say, issue 135 from the newsstand in Germany.
Okay.
And you got the older issues from the comic shop, and they sold old records and old comic books for reduced price. And we would, I for example had a paper route, and once I finished my paper route for that day, I would go right to the comic shop and buy my books.
You had a paper. You were one of those boys on a bicycle throwing newspapers at people's house. And if so, did you break any windows?
No, those were not newspapers, but they were like these gossip magazines for women, basically. And
really?
that was very funny because you basically always got a tip. That's how it worked. And
nice.
You worked for tips basically, and tip money sometimes was a lot, and you could buy a lot of comics. And you went with a bag full of magazines you brought to the ladies, and then you came back with an empty bag and put your comics in there. It was perfect.
Oh, nice.
We had comic shop. Well, we didn't have comic shops. We had near where I lived, there was a bookstore that was just called the Book Center.
Okay.
And you go in there, and they had paperback books, magazines, any sort of print material, in the back, in the back where you weren't supposed to go was the men's magazine.
You naughty boy! You were going back there. What age?
But there was loads and loads of comics, and the comics were very cheap. It was all, half price, half cover price, and it would be if you wanted, like for instance, anybody who you could trade. You could go in there, and he would give you 2 prices. It would be like, you bring in a box of comics or books, and he would tell, like, well, I'll buy these for this much, but if you just want trade, I'll give you more.
Oh, yes, I know that too.
Yeah, and there was another. Oh, I was just going to say, we had a whole chain. There was a chain of stores, and as far as I know, they were all over London and around the country, called the Popular Book Centre.
Nice.
And so you could get very cheap back issues, even Silver Age and Golden Age comics.
Really?
Unfortunately, they put a big stamp on the front cover, a rubber stamp with their name.
See, that's what I dealt with in the Grand Book Center. But it wasn't their stamp. It was actually original stamps from the newsstands giving you the date that they had to be pulled off the shelves. I don't know if you know of those stamps in the States, but they were supposed to pull it off the shelves, and they would stamp the cover. So, dude, I was finding, for example, Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commando comic books there in those packets for 50 cents.
Oh, cool.
And those are OG, you know what I mean? Those are wonderful books. Sergeant Rock, a lot of war comics. There was some, for some odd reason, but again, that's how I got put onto Gang War and Scourge and all that. Because again,
we had lots of war comics, and we had British war comics that would have lots of. We had British comics that would have war strips in them, because when you think about it, in the 1960s and early 70s, like My father, my grandfather, both were in the war, World War II.
Wow.
So those memories were still fresh. Like both my grandfathers died in the 70s. So growing up, and you've got war films on TV, war program documentaries on, things like that. Whenever they'd have remembrance for the war, it still felt very fresh. And so war stories were very fitting to have in a comic, because it was kind of like, well, this is what your father and your grandfather are telling you the story. So there's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why they didn't resonate now, because I think, there isn't, we're not, when you see things like, when the army goes into Iraq and other countries and Afghanistan, there's no one big villain. We're not fighting a Hitler anymore.
No, we're not.
And so we don't see that. We don't feel it like that. So, I think that a lot of kids aren't interested in that. And they certainly don't want to grow up and put their lives at risk, because, there seems to be conflict around. But there's no big enemy. We can't, like when Superman goes bounding into Berlin or anything like that.
Yeah.
You can't do that with it's like, it's I.C.C. Well, who's the guy? Who's the man?
It could be anybody.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of, it's not this big heroic battle. We're not saving a particular country or anything. It's a country no one's really. We don't know who they are. Like, the average. Yeah, see, if you don't know, if you have no familiarity with, if you can't even point to Iraq or Afghanistan on the map, how are you going to have any sort of affinity for? Like, you just don't care. You don't even know they're bad. You don't know why they're bad. You just know that.
Whatever, right? Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that you got to have that connection. You've got to have that.
I agree. I mean, I used to like before we go, I don't want to keep going the podcast too long, but there was this one great comic that Marvel produced, in the 80s, the Nam.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
You remember that?
Yeah, that
great war stories, and I knew a lot of Vietnam vets at the time, and I would ask their opinion about that particular book, and they were real about their assessment, whether or not it was true to life, and some agreed with a lot of the stories. Some was like, nah, man, it was darker than that, and it is what it is.
Well,
that was a great comic,
Doug Murray was a vet, so he was there.
Yeah, there was also, at that time, there were a lot of movies about Vietnam, so that was a different time, and there was a comic produced that fit into the Platoon world, if you will.
Yeah, the Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill. I mean, so it's awesome movies that came out at the time, no?
Yeah, but you see, but Nam was a different war. Nam wasn't that war where the whole world came together against the big enemy like Hitler, and there was no D-Day, there was no Battle of Britain to hang that on. It was very much, we got some pretty first-hand accounts from vets of what happened there.
Yep.
It wasn't heroic in a way.
At all.
It wasn't. Yeah, which meant that you couldn't. Kids aren't going to read. Kids don't want to. And you certainly don't want your kids to read war comics like that.
No, you don't. Not at all.
Yeah. So as parents change. Like the way I raised my kids was different to the way my parents raised me, and their parents raised them. There's that attitude to it. We're exposed to different things. We see different things. Different things mean different things to us. And I think that, for comics to grow, we have to stay in touch with what new generations want and we're interested in.
You know what? I think this is going to be a great topic for the next podcast, and talking about things that people are interested in, if they are at all. What I want to talk, I want you put this, plant the seed in your heads. Let's start talking about events. And are events important? like I mentioned earlier, right? We talked about how the Great Darkness Saga was an in-house event in its own particular title. But how do we feel about this new landscape where it takes multiple titles for you to read a whole story?
Why don't you do a poll, and you can do it on Twitter and
We could. Oh, beautiful.
Ask
why not?
the fans. Ask them which events resonated. What ones worked, what ones didn't.
What worked exactly? What was so key? What worked and what not? So just before, to give the fans some options before, and also give them the fill in your own option. I'm gonna give both you and Chris a choice right now. What is an event that you think actually resonated and made a change in comics, as opposed to just being a standard old event for sales?
The original Crisis.
Great choice right there, Chris. Great choice. I actually have the graphic novel that I want to make my family read so they could enjoy how great it is, because my wife, for example, is a big fan of the Flash show. And she said, what's this Infinite Crisis that I was talking about? How does he disappear? And obviously now with the cancellation of Arrow, we see that it's not going to be a Flash in the show. Spoiler alert for anybody. But but that's a great choice, because that was actually definitely made some big changes in the DCU, where we got the one universe and it destroyed the existence of the multiverse. What about you, Dave?
I would say Secret Wars, for all the wrong reasons.
Why? Yeah, because that's a very odd choice, And with Secret Wars that we're talking about, we're talking about the recent one that reintroduced Quake, or we're talking about the Beyond the Secret Wars?
Beyond the very first one.
All right. Hey, what would you say? Oh man, I can't. Okay, I'm not even gonna ask you here. We gotta pick that. Interesting choice.
Yeah, no, it's quite negative, because it's it was potentially a cool idea, and it was you could tell they thought about it, and it was clever. It's this event that takes place, but obviously all of the comic books that these characters appear in, like this 6-issue series took place or 12-issue series took place in 1 month.
Yeah, in 1 month, and then again, and we got to talk about what that really was intended for initially, before it became a thing in original comic continuity.
Well, it was supposed to launch a toy line. That's really all it was.
Mm-hmm.
But again, what it did was, and it was incredibly successful.
It was,
but it's like Watchmen and Dark Knight, in that here's a thing that has a big effect and makes a lot of money. And when things make a lot of money, it usually means that everyone's going to go, I'm going to copy that. We've got to do our one.
Yeah.
And it dilutes everything, because if you're constantly chasing the dollar like that to make as much money as possible out of your market, rather than treat them better, you're milking your audience, rather than keeping them on a regular. You're keeping them there. They're happy. You're bringing new people in. But then what happened is, around that time, Secret Wars, and then Watchmen, and then Dark Knight, all built into that thing where they all decided they were just going to milk their fans for everything good.
And this happens every 5 years.
I totally agree there. I'm listening to a podcast called The Cinephiles, and it's a really great podcast about movies. You should check it out. And there's one guy who says, well, this is a movie that moved Hollywood. And what he means by that is basically, if you have a movie like Silence of the Lambs, which is a huge success, everybody wants to make a movie like that. And they're milking it to death, basically. And the same is with these event comics. Some are ruining comics, in fact.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I get it. And do you agree with Dave's assessment as a whole, though? I mean, with the milking of properties sometimes through these events?
Absolutely.
All right, so great.
Yeah, Secret Wars 1, and then Secret Wars 2. And the second one is not as good as the first one. Well, I would say the first one wasn't that great anyway, but it's basically the same thing.
And they did another Secret Wars, with not beyond or less, if you will, So there's like 3 different Secret Wars and whatnot. But that's something to discuss. So we're definitely gonna ask the fans, like, what do they want us to definitely talk about in regards to these event books, because there's so many that have been diluting the market, and really which ones are really significant, which aren't. I mean, those are great things to talk about, in regards to our wonderful culture that we enjoy. But there's one story matter over another. There's some stick over another, because unfortunately, with the way that cuts. I mean, look at it right now. Just I'm gonna end it with this. Look at how a great example that what if books from the 80s, 70s, and 80s now becoming realizations, right? For example, the Jane Foster's of Thor. That was a what if book. It happened. What if the Hook with the Smart? That happened. What if Conan was in the 20th century? It happens now with the new Savage Avengers book that's coming up. That obviously, if you want to see Conan lead into the current century, just check out Avengers No Road Home. In order for you to get there, issue 6, I believe, is the one that introduces that. So again, look how old stories affect the current continuity, and should it be like that? So we'll see. So Dave, Chris, this has been a wonderful conversation. You dudes are just too well versed in comicdom, and this is fantastic. And I appreciate your time here. So with that, I'm Almega with Dave Elliott, with Chris Buse. This is the International Comics Collective. Check us out on Twitter. Check us out on undercovercapes.com. Hasta la próxima. Check out for our poll. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is an official Undercover Capes podcast. Thank you for listening to the I.C.C. and Undercover Capes. Make sure to visit our website, undercovercapes.com, and also visit the International Comics Collective on Twitter.